It's with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Terri Pigott as our next speaker. Terri is Associate Provost of Research at Loyola University in Chicago, where apparently the weather is a lot nicer than it is here. Who'd have thought? And Professor of Research Methodology. Terri's research focuses on methods for missing data in meta-analysis, power in meta-analysis, and outcome reporting bias. And she's written widely in this area, and we're very much looking forward to her training session on Friday as an introduction to meta-analysis. So thank you very much, Terri, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah and Paul and David, for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. So when getting ready for this talk, I began to think, well, how has systematic review influenced or not influenced education research? And so what I'm going to talk to you about today are sort of informed by my own idiosyncratic perspective as a research methodologist who's developed methods for meta-analysis in the social sciences, as a longtime faculty member in a school of education, most recently as the dean of a school of education, all in the US. And so what I'd like to talk about is sort of three questions came in my mind when I began to think about, at the launch of this Center UK and Ireland Campbell Center, what lessons can we learn about how systematic review has or has not been used in education, particularly in the US? So these are my three questions. And again, idiosyncratic to me and my experiences in US as someone who has been around education for a long time. So why is systematic review not used as widely in education as it is used in other areas like medicine? And then in the instances where systematic review has been used, why has it had sort of mixed influence on practice, especially in the US? And then what can we do to increase the impact or the influence of systematic review in educational research? So let's start with my first question. How has it been used in the US? Well, in fact, meta-analysis was started in educational research. In 1976, Gene Glass had a presidential address to the American Educational Research Association where he introduced the term meta-analysis. So actually education is the home of all of these, the beginning of all of these methods. So why doesn't it get used as much in education as, for example, in medicine? So one clue to this is a commentary that IAIN CHALMERS had in the journal Research Synthesis Methods, which was a special issue of this journal. It looked at the history of meta-analysis. And so one of the things he said, when answering the question about why we don't use systematic review as much in the social sciences as in medicine, he wrote, "People promoting research synthesis in health research were also often proponents of randomized trials for which dichotomous outcomes are usual. It is easier to do meta-analysis when we have something like you're either pregnant or not, or you're still alive or not, as opposed to what we have in education, which are all kinds of outcomes that we care about. We care about achievement, we care about attitude, we care about all kinds of things about children. And we not only have a wide range of outcomes that we care about, we have all kinds of ways we use to measure those things. It could be a standardized test, it could be observation, it could be anything. We have a wide range of outcomes, and in fact we do, with the exception of all of Paul's work, fewer randomized trials in education than in other areas. He goes on to say that perhaps the failures to synthesize the results of research assessing the effects of social and educational interventions may be one of the reasons why we don't have as many is because we have not had any avoidable deaths in education. That might be the case, but we certainly have had very poor interventions and very bad outcomes of those interventions. So why is it harder to conduct systematic review, perhaps, in education, which may be one reason to answer the question of why they're not used as much in education as in other areas? one of the answers is that educational interventions are by its nature complicated. There are multiple components. They're highly sensitive to the context and implementation issues and to student needs. And again, we have many, many more outcomes than just whether or not someone maybe had remission in their disease. We are interested in all kinds of things about students. So that makes doing systematic reviews and meta-analysis not impossible, but slightly more difficult than in other contexts, like medicine. Another reason why it's harder to do systematic review in meta-analysis in education is that we have a wide range of study designs. Again, with the exception of the work that you do here at Queen's, we do have fewer randomized trials due to the reasons that Paul mentioned earlier. Some people believe they're more difficult. They can be more difficult to do, and some people believe they shouldn't be doing them in certain contexts and questions. Education is also a multidisciplinary field. All kinds of people are interested in education. In my cynical way, sometimes I say, everyone thinks they're an expert because they went to school. But we do have economists, and we have anthropologists, and we have sociologists, and we have psychologists, all of these different disciplines coming together to talk about really important issues in education, but they all bring their own disciplinary perspective and the way that they decide to do studies. We have economists doing studies with large-scale data, sort of at the 30,000-foot level, and we have anthropologists who are interested in ethnographic methods and looking at the experience of children in classrooms. So we have this wide range of people and designs in education, which makes it not difficult, but more challenging to think about how we might do a systematic review and how we might garner and take all this evidence and say something about what's happening in an intervention. And we are also, again, as I said before, concerned with a wide range of questions. It's not just whether or not, on average, a treatment had an effect. We're also concerned in education with, well, how does it work? And why does it work? And for whom does it work? And in what context does it work? And Paul mentioned this also in his discussion of the limitations of single randomized trials. A third reason why it's more difficult to do systematic review in education is something that Julia mentioned. And it's particularly bad in education, I think. So in the US, for example, the largest research organization, the American Educational Research Association, doesn't have reporting guidelines for primary studies. And absolutely systematic review and meta-analysis are way more difficult when people are not reporting the same information consistently across studies. So that makes our job more challenging, not impossible. So again, systematic review may not happen as much in education because it's slightly more difficult because we have multiple, complex interventions, multiple outcomes measured differently across studies, wide ranges of study designs, and lack of reporting guidelines. Which leads to my second question. In cases where systematic review has been applied in education, especially in the US, why has it had mixed results? So I have two examples for you. One is the US National Reading Panel, and the second is the What Works Clearinghouse. I'm going to briefly give you these sort of two examples of efforts to look at combining evidence. So the National Reading Panel happened in 2000, and it was established as part of the US Congress Reading Excellence Act of 1996. So this was during the time of President George Bush, which some people in the US are now saying, I can't believe we're actually pining for President George Bush at this point, but we kind of are. But at that point, there was a big interest in the U.S. to look at evidence-based interventions. And the U.S. Congress established this National Reading Panel to identify reading interventions that had a strong evidence base, and these were the ones that were going to be promoted to be used in schools and also to garner more funding. So the National Reading Panel actually used systematic review and meta-analysis to examine published experimental and quasi-experimental studies on reading interventions, and concluded that systematic instruction in these areas, phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension strategies were evidence-based, and those were the ones that were going to be funded and promoted in the U.S. This report was widely criticized. There was so much backlash around it. And there were lots and lots of articles published on this. And I just picked one of these to highlight. Richard Ellington in 2006 provided a summary. And there were a couple key things that happened with this report. The first was the communication of its results was incredibly ineffective. The report happened, there was no really executive summary. Other people, other agencies and small groups did their own summary of the report without the people who wrote the report. And so there were wide inaccuracies in how the report was discussed. Okay. The second issue was that many people in the reading field just felt like the areas of focus that came out of that report were very narrowly defined. The reading researchers had a wider range of interventions that they thought could also be effective, but it turned out that only those five areas got the main focus. Particularly probably because those were the areas in which it was easier to do randomized trials. They were very scripted, systematic interventions, which are much easier to implement than other kinds of reading interventions. And it was much easier to do an experimental study of those. So there was this confluence of deciding that where the studies were, those were the only interventions that were important. Okay. And then there was a very lack of guidance in that report for how you would even implement those particular strategies that were decided that were important. So, I think also in I looking at these reports that the meta-analyses in these reports were actually limited. They were limited at the time, and they're very much limited now when we look back 17 years later by current standards, because they used very simple methods and didn't ask those. They asked the question of what is effective, but they didn't ask the question of what is effective for whom, or how much variation is there. And Paul showed. Thank you, Paul. Showed the force plot of a reading intervention that shows you how much variation there could be. So. And I think part of the criticism of that report was also just caught up in the politics of the time. Those of us who are in education know education is political. That is, the politics of education, particularly in the US, are fraught. And so I think what happened in that report was that it got caught up in this wave of people really being upset about a big focus on accountability in the US. So I think it also was a victim of political issues. So my second example of sort of a mixed view of what happens when we review research in education. One more thing. So currently in reading research I thought was interesting. In 2000, when the Handbook of Reading Research was published, these get published every 10 years. They're very important pieces of research that get published in reading. In 2000, that volume had a whole chapter in systematic review, and in 2010, nothing. So I'm not a reading researcher. I dabble in that. I mean, I've worked with reading researchers. I thought it was interesting that I don't know where systematic review is anymore in that field. My second example is the What Works Clearinghouse. Around the same time as the reading research, as the National Panel Report, what also came out of that time was a need for, in education, at least in the U.S., to find evidence-based, to help practitioners find evidence-based interventions that they could apply in their schools. And so what came out of that is this thing called the What Works Clearinghouse. And so I just pulled this off the website the other day. So for more than a decade, the What Works Clearinghouse what they've done is reviewed individual primary studies of educational interventions and then rate the quality of that evidence. For the idea is that then practitioners in schools would go in and find, the intervention they want to apply in their school, and then there would be a set of studies that was rated for them. So this is an example of the one for phonological awareness training. It's hard to see, but what they would do is say, okay, for phonological processing, for that outcome, we have 5 studies that meet the standards. The grades examined are P for pre-kindergarten and K for kindergarten. Those 5 studies have 120 students in them, and then an average across those studies, you would get maybe the average is 27% percentile improvement in your students. And this is the information given in the What Works Clearinghouse. I see Julia is rolling her eyes. So as you might guess, they're not using systematic review. They're not using meta-analysis. There's nothing about transparency. There's 5 studies there. I guarantee you there are hundreds of studies on phonological awareness training. So we don't know what happened to those other studies. We don't know what those 5 studies are. So there's this focus on the What Works Clearinghouse on single studies of high quality. And I don't have to tell you now, you've heard everyone else ahead of me, the issues with looking at single studies. Limited use of systematic review and meta-analysis, and a lack of transparency. And also, it's not clear to me that practitioners use this. I have anecdotal evidence about this, but I'm pretty sure that the principals I know are not going to the What Works Clearinghouse to figure out if they should use one kind of phonological training versus another. So, and here's an area where I really think systematic review and meta-analysis could add value. So what prevented a greater influence of systematic reviews in education given these 2 examples? So in the National Reading Panel example, I think just that narrow focus on only the interventions with experimental evidence and not actually at least acknowledging other kinds of interventions. And then an application of, then sort of a dissemination of the results that went beyond what the results said and were probably not warranted. And again, that difficulty in communicating the results to practitioners. And in the What Works Clearinghouse example, just the focus on individual studies, and I don't need to belabor the point of everyone that has come before me today in talking about the danger of looking at individual studies. And again, difficulty in communicating to practitioners. So as we are here for the launch of the Campbell UK and Ireland, what can we do to increase the use and influence of systematic review, specifically and particularly in education? So first, I think we need to develop and use methods that reflect the diversity of educational research that exists. And we are at Campbell, in conversations about what that looks like for Campbell. And I think in the wider field of education, which I am also a part of, I think we need to think about that as well. We need to have meta-analysis methods and systematic review methods that actually reflect the research designs that we are using. So methods for single case studies, for example. There is a whole body of literature in education that uses single case designs. And there are lots of exciting developments there in terms of how to combine all those single case studies in a systematic review. We have lots of methods now for how do we deal with multiple outcomes in a study. I don't think any of you who are reading primary research, especially in education, has ever seen a study that talked about one outcome. We have multiple outcomes in studies. How do we think about that? How do we deal with that? And then developing ways of representing the results of studies that use complex designs. The economists keep upping the ante on these complex designs. How do we keep that evidence also in our studies? Also, and we're in conversations in Campbell about this too. How about developing and using systematic review methods for a wider range of research questions as well? And this is a little trickier area, but there are lots of efforts in meta-analysis and systematic review to think about other kinds of questions. So for example, perhaps we're interested in looking at relationships between educational constructs that we would normally use a path analysis for. So perhaps we think, for example, a student's attitude toward reading might impact how they comprehend a passage, which may also impact how they achieve. And maybe we want to understand that path. So there are methods being developed for that. Network meta-analysis, where we're looking at actually trying to choose among multiple interventions on the same topic. So there could be, as we know, lots of ways to improve reading comprehension of students. How do we use, there are new methods, network meta-analysis, for actually trying to choose between these different methods, even if we don't have studies that pit these against each other directly. There are lots of methods for diagnostic and prognostic tests that we have yet to use very widely in education. So these are methods that help us understand how well we are diagnosing, how well a test might help us diagnose a problem in a student, also how well a test might predict how a student might achieve at a later time. These are all kinds of methods that I think we need to think about using more in education. And then there is all that evidence that we don't know what to do with. All the qualitative evidence that we might have about how and why an intervention works. And so it would be great if we could find a way to have that inform our efforts to understand a body of literature in education. We need effective methods for communicating findings from systematic reviews. We need to use much better ways of trying to get these results out there. We need evidence maps, which I hope Howard will talk about. But Howard has been using. We need to apply knowledge translation research. How do people understand knowledge in a study? How do they take it up? All those kinds of things, we need to apply that. And we need those collaborations. I think that has already been touched on by Peter in particular. Collaborations among researchers, practitioners, students, people involved in education to understand how we can better help them do their job. We also need to increase the quality of both systematic reviews and primary studies. And I think everyone before me has touched on this. Systematic review can help identify problems in primary literature and holes in the literature, which can help improve primary research. And the better primary research we have, the better systematic reviews we have. So this is a sort of a way for us to just increase what we're doing, increase the quality of what we're doing. In order to improve the quality of both systematic reviews and primary studies, we actually need to use the quality standards. We need to develop them and we need to use them. The American Psychological Association actually does have standards for journal article reporting and meta-analysis, but I review regularly for psychology journals in the US and they don't even use these. So I'm not sure how we begin to do that. but we need to continue to do that. And I just have an example here of the Consort SPI, which is an extension of Consort for social and psychological interventions. That is another example of an effort to do this. So meta-analysis actually did start in education, and we should be at the forefront of using these methods and developing these methods. And the issues that we face in education and social sciences, and as we saw in criminology, are complex, and they do require sort of multidisciplinary approaches to think about them. I think education is one of those areas where we do need everyone at the table with their perspectives thinking about these really complex issues. So I really obviously believe that systematic review and meta-analysis can help us make sense of this very complex research we have in education. Not to improve primary studies, and also to ensure that we're efficient in our efforts, because at least in the US, we're seeing a pullback on educational research funding. So if we're not going to have as much funding, we better be more efficient in how we use the money. And also to find ways that we can have research-informed practice much more directly and much quicker. Thank you.